Good morning and welcome to Bloomberg UK. A special focus on the biggest challenges facing the British government, economy, financial services, and of course the markets. I'm Kriti Gupta in London. Just going to start in the political space. UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, his ruling Conservative Party, could face a reckoning with voters this year. Britain now expected to head to the polls in 2024 with an election most likely in either the spring or the autumn. But before then, Sunak has some work to do. Opinion polls show that the Labour Party maintains a wide lead over the Tories, and the Prime Minister's popularity among voters in his own party at a record low. Well, top of mind for the public is the cost of living. Despite inflation dropping way faster than economists expected, it's putting way more pressure on Sunak when it comes to things like tax cuts, immigration, and even health care. And now the Prime Minister has began 2023 asking voters to judge him by 5 pledges, but a year later, he can only claim victory on one of them. It leaves him in an uphill battle to fight before the election, and with a preview of the year ahead in British politics, as well as the economic data out later today. UK correspondent Lizzy Burden is all over that story. She joins me right here on set. Let's start with some comments here coming from Labour leader Keir Starmer.
Yes, he's going to be speaking later today in Bristol. He's expected to present himself as the change candidate, saying that Britain's crying out for change after 14 years almost of national decline. He's going to say it's time for national renewal under Labour. But we're also going to hear from Rishi Sunak, and he too will present himself as the change candidate after Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. But it's a difficult position for him. As you say, Sunak's Conservative Party is behind over 20 points in the polls, and his party's divided after all this time in power. But in the Labour camp, you've got strategists warning their own members, don't be complacent. They point to Donald Trump's 2016 victory, where actually the result defied the polls running up to it. And so this is a glimmer of hope for Rishi Sunak. He's going to himself try to defy the polls, and an opportunity for that will be the budget. So we've got an early budget on March the 6th. It's set tongues wagging in Westminster whether we're actually going to have an early election in May. And what the Chancellor, we expect, will try to do is lay a load of traps for Labour in terms of tax cuts, making tax cuts that Labour would struggle to reverse, but then would struggle to keep up with their own fiscal commitments in addition. And then the question becomes for our audience, will the bond market have faith in Labour's spending plans? There's so many things to dive into there. And Lizzy, we know that we are going to be able to count on you for all of it. But for now, we have to leave it there. Lizzy Burden there, our UK correspondent, walking us through some of the key parts of kind of what Sunak has on his plate. But of course, as the prospect of a general election nears, as Lizzy just pointed out, the economic policies of both Labour and the Conservatives coming into focus for the voters. I want to get a little bit more analysis, build on what Lizzy Burden had to say with Lizzy Galbraith, political economist over at Aberdeen. Lizzy, a pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you for joining us this morning. Build a little bit on what the other Lizzy just had to talk about, just how much work Sunak actually has cut out for him, and how much the timing of an election may work either for or against him.
So Sunak does have an awful lot of work to do. We haven't really seen him make any headway in the Conservatives' polling deficit over the last year since he became leader of the Conservative Party. And that's a real challenge. It was always going to be difficult to come back from a 20-point polling deficit in 2 years. It's even more challenging to try and do it in one. And we've seen the Conservatives try multiple different resets, lots of different approaches, and nothing's really persuaded the public to look again at the Conservatives after some rocky few years in government. So I expect Sunak to try and use the budget coming up in March as the next springboard moment for the Conservatives. I expect him to try and focus that budget on some public-friendly sort of retail policies, possibly including some more tax cuts to try and cut through with the public, and to try and get some gaps between Conservative policy and Labour policy. But nonetheless, it is going to be extremely challenging. And on the timing of that election, one of the big questions is, yes, may make a lot of sense to some strategists in the Conservative Party. It allows you to go earlier to make sure that you know the ground you're working with. But equally, that would only give them 6 months to turn things around. And that is a very, very tall order. We do know that, generally speaking, the polls tend to narrow in favour of the incumbent government ahead of elections in the UK. but a 20-point narrowing is a really, really big ask. And I think Sunak does face a huge, huge battle to gain the support that he would need to stay in power by the end of this year.
Lizzy, we're talking a lot about tax cuts. We're talking about them being in the spring budget. Can we just get down to the numbers here? Can the UK government even afford tax cuts right now?
It's a really tricky question because actually what we saw at the autumn statement was the government use some frankly unsustainable future public spending cuts to finance the tax cuts it announced then. So I think one of the things that we're going to be looking at quite closely is just how credible this strategy can be for the Conservatives going forward. We're already seeing quite a lot of scrutiny of whether Labour's spending plans are credible. I think that actually the same question can be asked of the Conservatives as well, because if you're penciling in these really quite steep public spending cuts at the tail end of your fiscal horizon to finance tax cuts now, I would question whether or not that's feasible. And if we see the Conservatives return to that strategy in the spring, depending on what the fiscal outlook looks like then I think that could be questioned more vocally this time around if they become sort of repeat users of that strategy going forwards.
So a lot dependent on the fiscal outlook, but a lot dependent on the monetary outlook as well. Rishi Sunak very famously, when asked about why the Conservatives aren't actually delivering on the tax cuts that have been such a legacy of their party, saying that, well, inflation is a tax and therefore inflation is the number one priority. Talk to us a little bit about now the fact that rate cuts are actually getting priced into the market. Does that just add even more pressure for Sunak to deliver?
I think it probably will certainly add to the clamour on the Conservative backbenches. There's many people in the Conservative Party that have been calling for tax cuts now for some time, and any improvements in the economic position of the UK will lead to those calls intensifying. One of the things to note, though, is that although Conservative MPs generally do want tax cuts, they don't necessarily agree on what those tax cuts should look like or what taxes to focus on. Some Conservative MPs are very keen to see inheritance tax cut, for example. Others would like the government to focus more on income tax. So there is differences of opinion within the Conservative Party on that. But we think that we're not actually going to see any rate cuts in the UK until June, which would put it past the spring budget. It may well be one of the factors that leads the government to hold on until the autumn to actually hold that general election and be able to point to rate cuts as a measurable sign that the economy is turning a corner and that they've led an improvement in the public finances.
By comparison, though, is the Labour Party offering anything better? We know that some of the green policies, for example, have been kind of a pillar of some of what they have to bring to the table. But again, the affordability question kind of rears its ugly head again. And we know that even Rishi Sunak has pulled back on some of that green spending as well. Can Labour keep up?
This is the big question. We've had some quite eye-catching policies from Labour. We've got some very ambitious plans for a very different style of government under Keir Starmer, but they haven't really yet been able to fill in the blanks about how they would actually afford this. They've swerved a lot of questions about what taxation would look like. They're swerving questions about what their fiscal rules would look like. And that is going to be something that Labour are going to have to work on really hard this year. We know that a lot of their policies are individually quite attractive to the public, but there remain a lot of concerns about whether they're actually able to implement them in practice. And I think that is going to be the big question for Labour. Can they maintain this poll lead that they've built up over the past 2 years, while actually explaining how they're going to fund these measures? Can these policies remain credible to both the public and to markets once they are scrutinised, once the costing of these policies is scrutinised going forwards? And we're likely to see the Conservatives really try and ramp home the scale of what Labour's pledging as well, present it as a risk to any economic recovery that we see by the time the election is held.
What kind of progress might we see on the cost of living crisis seems to be the central question for 2024. Lizzy Galbraith, we have to leave it there. She's, of course, the political economist over at Aberdeen. We thank you so much for insight and analysis this morning. Plenty more on some of the big election issues coming up on the program. Stick with us. This is Bloomberg. Rishi Sunak's battle to return to number 10 will depend on public opinion over key issues like immigration, the economy, and even healthcare. From Supreme Court rulings to doctor strike, the past few months have been quite the challenge for the Prime Minister. Joining me now, our Westminster watcher, UK correspondent, our political team expert, whatever you want to call his title. Joe Mays is all over this story. Joe, talk to us about his success, perhaps, when it comes to Rishi Sunak.
Well, it's been tricky on those big 5 pledges, which include things like cutting waiting lists in the NHS, reducing small boats crossings, growing the economy, cutting debt. On pretty much all of these issues, it's been very tough. NHS waiting lists, larger than when he took control as Prime Minister. We have debt has not fallen. The economy has barely grown. Yes, small boats crossings have come down a bit, but he hasn't stopped them. He can score success on the goal of halving inflation, but that's kind of 4 out of 5 where he hasn't really succeeded. So it's looking pretty tough in terms of will voters take a step back and say you have succeeded as Prime Minister. I think that's tricky for him.
How much of a role does timing play here? We're talking about a general election either in the spring or the fall. Does the extra time, is that a benefit for Rishi Sunak or does that work against him?
I mean, that's the big question in Westminster. How do you make that calculation? My sense is that he will probably want to continue in office for really as long as he can and hope that the economy improves perhaps and hope that in the minds of voters he can perhaps deliver some more tax cuts in, say, a spring budget, allow those to take hold, make people feel the benefit of that, hope that the cost of living crisis eases, and then push that election or into the autumn. But, that is the big question. How do you make that calculation?
But what does that mean for Sunak? Like, what's on his to-do list there to win over the public?
I think it's just having more time in number 10 to just deliver the policies and the promises that he's set out, such as on small boats, such as on improving the state of the NHS. Just give yourself more time in office to make progress on these issues. That might be how he sees it. But there are risks to that. For example, if you go for an election in the autumn, you then have a summer where there might be more small boats crossings, which would hurt your ability to claim success on that pledge. So it's a really tricky balancing act, and he's got some big decisions to make when it comes to that election timing.
In terms of the competition, what he's up against here feels like every time there's a kind of knock against Rishi Sunak, it's a win for the Labour Party. Obviously, it's an enemy political system. But are the Labour Party's policies competitive at all here?
Well, we're still at a stage where Labour hasn't really set out in great detail what their policy platform is. It's still somewhat vague. We have some pledges such as spending £28 billion a year on the net zero transition over the course of the next Parliament. We have things like scrapping the non-dom tax status. There's some headline pledges, but the depth of the policy platform isn't there. And we'll be looking for that in these next few months, and voters will have to take a look at that. So, yeah, it's kind of a watch and see, really, when it comes to Labour's policy positions.
Yeah, certainly a lot to digest there. Bloomberg's Joe Mays all over it, our Westminster watcher. I love that alliteration. He's going to be adding that to his business cards anytime soon. We thank you so much for your analysis this morning. Coming up, what does it mean for the markets, for the investability of the UK broadly? Plus, London's FTSE 100 turning 40 this week. It sounds like a celebration. It sounds like something to be excited about. Is it really? We're going to dive into it. Stick with us. This is Bloomberg. London's FTSE 100 turns 40 this week, but some might argue there isn't that much to celebrate as the index trailed its counterparts in recent years. Celebrating or maybe even cringing is Bloomberg's senior markets editor and opinion columnist, John Authers. He joins me right here on set. John, you wrote a column this week about that kind of underperformance. Even though the FTSE 100 is one of the most investable in terms of access indexes in the world, why is it falling behind?
Well, there's a number of reasons. Obviously, some of this is to do with the UK economy. Some of this is to do with the lack of big tech companies. If there were a British Google or Amazon, presumably it wouldn't be lagging anything like as much. there is certainly a strong argument to be made that British pension funds, which have been encouraged to... There was a great concern about 20 years ago about the possibility of a pension crisis, making sure that they were able to meet their guarantees to their pensions, but what that involved was selling stocks and buying bonds, with the result that we're now, much more underinvested as a nation than most other leading countries. So there's lots of reasons behind it, but there's no real way of obscuring the fact that this is disappointing. London was absolutely an equivalent to New York for many years, and in the last 15 or so, the way the stock markets have diverged is, pretty soul-crushing if you're British.
Yeah, and you're already even seeing that add to some of the damage that even in just the last year you saw in terms of the IPO market and the deal market. The flows aren't coming to London. I love that you said that there's no Apple or Microsoft equivalent in the UK. As you were speaking, we look up the top 5 members of the FTSE 100. Out of the top, Shell, AstraZeneca, HSBC, Unilever, and BP. Those are 5 very different companies.
It doesn't sound so unlike the Dow Industrials for much of its history. It's just it needs a couple of tech companies in there because that's where all the growth is these days, and there are none, which is a little sad.
But couldn't you argue, I mean, one of the criticisms of some of the other indices around the world is that it's not diversified enough, that breadth is a real issue. Isn't the FTSE 100 serving that on a platter?
You could, yes. You can make that argument. You don't have the really massive over-concentration that you have in the S&P 500 these days, thanks to the Magnificent Seven.
Or the Stock 600 with luxury.
But you do also need to bear in mind London's greatest claim to eminence these days is that it's still the venue of choice for big commodity companies. So there's a large number of mining companies that are quoted here that really have a head office here and all their operations are somewhere else. And so you could argue that we are overexposed towards the materials sector here. And that is part of the underperformance of the last 15 years is that it's been a bear market for commodities, and that's bad for companies like Rio Tinto and Glencore who are quoted here.
I want to continue that tour of assets because as we talk about, of course, the stock market and the exposure you want to the commodity space through some of these kind of British adjacent stocks, or at least stocks that are listed here in the UK, we should talk about the exposure to commodities through the currency space as well. Because, of course, London known as the hub for commodities, but also foreign exchange for the same level. Is there a read-through between the cyclicality of the commodity space and the cyclicality of the pound? And don't make me repeat the fact that some would call the pound an EM currency or acting like an EM currency. But is there some kernel of truth to that?
Yes, there is some kernel of truth to that. I mean, at the moment we have a thoroughly dollar-oriented system, so a lot of it is dependent on if the dollar has an inverse relationship with commodity prices in many cases because commodities are denominated in dollars. Therefore, when the dollar is getting weaker against commodities, the pound will generally get stronger. And I mean, that is a way in which, not getting back into the entire Brexit debate, but there is a sense in which there is a loss of sovereignty for more or less everybody other than the states because so many critical decisions about the currency are sort of dependent on big global markets rather than on any decisions you can make here. I mean, in general, I think because we have seen such an aggressive pivot in the States, that means you get a yield pickup with gilts compared to treasuries, and it means that the pound at the moment, when you think it nearly broke parity, 15 months ago, looks oddly strong. If it's a very popular call that the dollar is going to be weak this year, it's also a very popular call that the Bank of England is going to cut many times this year, faster even than the Fed, which I find
ironic, isn't it? Because Andrew Bailey was supposed to be the last hawk standing, and now perhaps the first to crumble? What do you think?
I think that the I think the excitement about imminent rate cuts is overdone back in the US. I think it's overdone here. There's a very good reason why they might be more likely to cut here, which is that the economy is in worse shape.
Yeah.
If you're going to have a recession, that strengthens the case for cuts quite considerably.
Yeah.
That said, I did just check. Core inflation has come down very fast and much faster than expected. It's still over 5% in the UK. And the Bank of England has a single mandate on inflation. I don't see how you can cut as aggressively as people think they're going to unless, core inflation really keeps careening down. So I am personally nervous about whether that degree of help from interest rates is going to arrive.
John, I'm going to put you on the spot. 30 seconds here.
Yeah.
We have a potential general election coming up this year. Tax cuts on the agenda. Will a potential tax cut from the Tories change the market view of the UK? 30 seconds.
No. Well, if you want me to take a few more seconds than that, we learned from the Liz Truss gilt crisis that the markets don't think that this country has any fiscal space. Part of the reason they're so calm about Labour is they think they won't be able to spend anything. And part of the reason they're so calm about the Tories is they don't think they'll be able to cut tax. I don't think it would make a difference.
Well, the market's voting quite literally with their dollars, and in this case, their pounds, and saying that, well, Rishi Sunak and his counterparts maybe can't deliver. That is the take from John Authers, our Bloomberg senior editor for markets and opinion columnist right here. We thank you so much for joining us today. That does it for the Bloomberg UK show. Bloomberg Brief is next. Danny Berger in London, Manus Cranny in New York, setting you up for the U.S. trading day and everything you need to know going into the end of the week. Stick with us. This is Bloomberg.